You know, it must be an interesting day when I've got both of my Bibles up here. So. working back and forth between two different translations because, well, I'm more comfortable preaching and teaching out of the King James, or actually the New American Standard Version at this point. I grew up with the NIV, and so there are times when the language just works better for me from the King James Version, or sorry, I keep saying that, from the NIV. So we'll see whether that's really necessary today or not. But so we're going to do a couple things today. One of them was Mark asked a question at the end of not last class but the previous class that I really didn't address yesterday. I'm having some problems talking today, which bodes ill since I'm the guy who's preaching.
Well, look at it this way, you got an hour to warm up.
That's right. Let's hope it works. So anyway, last week I didn't really have a chance to address it because we had a lot to cover and I did want to get through with the Medes and Persian Empire last week. So I kind of set it off. But the question you asked at the end of the previous lesson was, why is it that the Jews are so determined to be in Judah and Jerusalem, and in particular to build a temple in Jerusalem, that's where the focus of their religion continues to be. And like I said, even then, the brief little bit I talked about it, it is an interesting question because if you look historically, the temple in particular was actually a tabernacle. It was designed to be a flexible, moving structure to move with them as they moved through the desert and ultimately as they moved into the Promised Land. And for several hundred years in the Promised Land, that was where they worshiped, not in the temple. The temple wasn't built until Solomon, and that was quite some time after they'd actually entered into the Promised Land. So why is there such a maybe not obsession, but why is there such a focus around the temple, around its position in Jerusalem, and more broadly, why is there such a focus from the Jewish standpoint of being in this one particular place? So I want to talk about that a little bit this morning as we got started. And the first thing I want to kind of point out is something we see in the maps as we go through and look at the different empires that conquered this area. And what's interesting as you look at these different maps is this is the Assyrian Empire, which predates, this goes further back than what we were even talking about last week. Then we have the Babylonian Empire, and then we have the Medes and the Persians. And the thing that you see in all of these maps is this kind of interesting shape. There's always kind of this gap here where this area gets conquered. Does anybody know why this area is just kind of empty?
Not the Arabian desert.
Yeah, because that area is literally just kind of empty. There's nothing there. It's a desert, and so it's not a place. It's not a place where you go to conquer. You know, there are nomadic tribes that live there that are capable of living on very, very little water and very, very little sustenance. But nobody wants to try to conquer that because what are you going to do with it? You can't farm anything there. You can't build anything there because you can't build a city if you don't have water. There's really nothing useful about that. And so what happens is that this area is not an area that is of value in general to the conquerors of this time period. Now, it turns out that this area is actually very, very valuable because of what? Oil. So what they didn't care about, 4,000 or 5,000 years, or about 3,000 years ago, is really, really important now. But because of their concerns, it didn't matter. And more than that, this area, because of the distances involved in the lack of water, is not an area that you can effectively move large groups of troops or caravans of valuables or whatever across. This is just a dead area. And so...
The movie Lawrence of Arabia.
Okay, yeah. So if you think about that, though, what that means, though, is that when you think about, in the context of the time periods we're talking about, the major places of significance in this part of the world are Egypt over in here, Greece up here, Turkey, or what was considered Asia Minor at the time, and then the Babylonian and Median and Persian empires, and then over further, you start to get into what we think of today as the Russian ethnic types of people. What's that? Byzantine Empire, whatever. Those empires didn't really exist, and there was kind of a long gap between that kind of the edge of this empire and the next major empire, which was China, which is really the only other great empire during this period of time. And so the issue is, if you're trying to move men or goods throughout this area, if you want to go down in here and into the area of Africa that does have both goods that you want to bring back and places that you want to take them to, this is pretty much the most effective way to get there. I mean, the only other alternative is to go up in here and get on a ship and try to sail across the Mediterranean Sea. But the reality is, particularly until maybe 100 years or so before Christ, ship travel over any significant distance was just not really very reliable. You're basically kind of, rolling the dice, literally, when you got onto a ship to see if you could survive a trip across the Mediterranean Sea or something like that. So what happens is, and this is so interesting because God made covenants with Abraham that were focused around this area of the world, and without even necessarily, obviously, Abraham didn't see the bigger picture of the global and the world economy and stuff like that. Without any maybe larger understanding of the situation, what God was promising Abraham was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the entire world. Not just because the land of Canaan was fertile and good to live in and stuff like that, but because that area of the world is so, and that section right there is so important to travel, to commerce, to all of this kind of stuff. And so, in one respect, given how valuable this area is, it's actually kind of astonishing that the Israelites were able to hold on to it for as long as they did. And it actually speaks to the providence of God that in spite of the massive, powerful nations around them that would have very much liked to control that area, that Israel and Judah controlled it for, 1,000 years almost, something like that, before they were ultimately conquered by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians. So when we talk about, the area itself, one of the things to kind of keep in mind is that it is a tremendously valuable piece of land. But I don't think that's really the heart of why the people of Israel, the Jews, feel like that's where they need to be. The core of it is that unlike any other nations in history, they were promised that land. I mean, it's literally the promised land. They were promised that land. It was given to them by covenant to their forefather, Abraham, and passed down through generations, that those promises, those covenants. And so to them, it's not even like they deserve it or they have a right to it or something. It's more like it's a holy obligation to be there because that's the land that was promised to them. And so you kind of have a weird situation in modern day Israel because you have there's a lot of different groups, but there are two kind of key parties in Israel at this point. One of them is the secular government and the secular party of Israel, which really does control the governance and the decisions about what the military is going to do and what territories they're going to hold on to or what territories they're going to occupy, things like that. And then you also, on the other side of it, you have the Orthodox Jews that are the more conservative group of Jews that are the most outspoken ones. And those Orthodox Jews would very much like to go ahead and actually retake all of Jerusalem, expel all the Arabs from it, and knock down the mosque that's on the Temple Mount and rebuild the temple. The secular Israeli government is not interested in doing that because they know that the second they do that, that all of the nations around them will attack them. And that will be the end of Israel unless, really as a practical matter, that'll be the end of Israel. So they're not interested in starting that kind of a fight. The secular government of Israel, the secular groups and parties of Israel are concerned about the Israeli people maintaining their homeland. And they're willing to forego a lot of the religious aspects of that in order to make sure that they can maintain their homeland. Whereas you have the religious groups, and like I said, particularly the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox, that believe that it's not really their homeland until they've retaken it completely and they can put their religious stuff back into place. So that's kind of the underlying tension that you have in modern day Israel, where the kind of the agreed to truth is that everybody wants to make sure they keep their land. But what they're disagreeing about is to what degree they should control and be able to do what they want to in that land. So you kind of can see, though, where when you have that kind of a background, that kind of a history, from a religious standpoint, it's very hard to entertain the notion of going somewhere else, you know, of giving up that homeland. And even Jews that don't live there have a hard time with the notion of giving up the Israelite homeland, because that's where their forefathers were promised. That's where there's a religious, like I said, a religious connection.
There's for the earlier Jew, maybe not so much today, but for the earlier Jew that placed emphasis on Jerusalem, there was another promise that had been given by God that He would name the city that was going to be where He dwelt.
Right.
And that was, and He picked city
Right.
of David, He called it, but Jerusalem.
Right.
And then also he when the temple was built, when the tabernacle was there, His presence was there, and His presence was when they dedicated the temple. If you remember, God ran out all of the priests with the cloud,
yes,
and with the smoke. I mean, so His presence was there, and it was very important to the Jews. And I think that's a big reason why the emphasis of them wanting to go back to Jerusalem, wanting to build the temple, was because God had promised to be in that temple.
yes.
Was the tabernacle ever in Jerusalem?
Yes.
It was?
Well,
yes.
it was moved there
Right
during
before the
Solomon's
dedication of the
time,
temple. Yeah. This is what I was wanting to look at, because what Jerry said reminded me. So what happens in 1 Kings chapter 8 is that they finished building the temple in chapter 7. In chapter 8, then it says, this is in verse 4, they brought up the ark of the Lord in the tent of meeting, and all the holy utensils which were in the tent, and the priests and the Levites brought them up. So this was actually the only time that the tabernacle was actually, well, that's not true. The tabernacle was in Jerusalem under David as well, because he brought the ark there, and he wouldn't have brought the ark there. It doesn't explicitly say that the tabernacle was there, but he wouldn't have brought the ark there if the tabernacle wasn't there, because there wouldn't have been a point in doing that. So apparently it was in Jerusalem under David at some point. It was brought there at some point. But then what happens is, where is it? Yeah, there's kind of this indication. I forget. It's not here in Kings. I forget where I've read this or seen this. It's kind of this indication. As he says, there's no question. The cloud, the glory of the Lord fills the temple. But there's kind of this indication that it moves from the tabernacle over to the temple when the ark is moved from the tabernacle to the temple, which makes sense because the mercy seat is actually part of the Ark of the Covenant, and that's kind of where God's presence was thought to dwell. So to your point, though, Jerry, and actually you're taking me to the next phase of this, which is what I want to talk about anyway, which is, so what happens is, the promises to Abraham are the land of Canaan, and, you know, kind of generalized boundaries of the land of Canaan. But what happens once the Israelites get in there, and ultimately once David conquers Jerusalem, is that you see this shift in the writing, and it shifts from talking so much about the land to talking about Zion, which is Jerusalem, which is the holy city, the city of David. There's different terms, but Zion is the term that keeps showing up, particularly in the Psalms, in some of the prophecies by Jeremiah and Isaiah, Zechariah. Zion keeps coming up, and it still talks about people going back to the, you know, when Jeremiah's talking about them being taken away, there's going to be a return to the land. But over and over again, there's this idea that Zion is the representative concept, the representative center of Israel from that point on. And so what happens, I think, is that there is this sort of transfer of focus from the land of Israel as a whole to Zion as the specific manifestation of God's seat, as Jerry says, and of this holy city. And interestingly, that also influenced that thinking and that understanding influenced Muhammad as well when he was talking about the holy cities and basically where he had his visions at. Mecca was one of them. I'm forgetting the second one, but Jerusalem was the third one. He claimed to have had a vision in Jerusalem, or I forget, maybe the vision took him to Jerusalem, but either way, ultimately, because of that vision, Muhammad declared Jerusalem to be one of the holy cities as well. And so in his case, there were three. In the case of the Israelites, there's just the one, which is actually kind of ironic when you think about it, because in Christianity we have the Godhead, the three, and Islam believes that there can only be one God and there cannot be three aspects to it, so kind of reversing the three in one thing. But anyway, so once that focus became lasered in on Jerusalem, then Jerusalem became kind of inextricably a part of or inherent to the idea that the Israelites are controlling their own land. If you don't have control of Jerusalem, you don't really control the promised land, because Jerusalem, Zion, is the city of promise. And there are promises that are made throughout the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets, that indicate that the ultimate victory of the Israelites will come and is tied into Zion and into events that will happen around Zion. So for the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox Jew who believe in a literal fulfillment of those prophecies, the notion of losing control of Zion is deeply problematic, because that would create a problem with the prophecies. And so there's this need, from that standpoint, to have control over Jerusalem. And by the same token, there's this association now of Jerusalem, of Zion, with where the temple is, with where God's presence is. And so even though the tabernacle was designed to be flexible and be able to move from place to place, the temple, once it was built, it's kind of like, well, now that we've built something, we can't go back to moving it around from place to place, because now Zion is where God is, you know. And so they don't want to, there's no willingness to kind of try to go back to the tabernacle-based kind of worship, or to build a temple somewhere else. And if they tried to build a temple anywhere in Jerusalem, the response from the Arab nations would be just about as bad as if they tore down the mosque and built it on the Temple Mount. The reality is that the Arab nations will never tolerate the Jews building a temple in Jerusalem again, regardless of where it is. Jerry?
During several attempts by the Assyrian government to take over Israel, Judah, they did conquer many of the towns around Jerusalem, yes, but they were ineffective in getting to the center and getting Jerusalem. I mean, with God's help, right, a number of times. But that, I mean, I think the emphasis by God has been Jerusalem.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Jerusalem is the capital city as well. So you could look at the situation like in Hezekiah's era, where Assyria invades and they conquer Lachish, which is fairly close, but they're trying to conquer the capital city. If you can't conquer the capital city, you don't really fully control the territory. And so that's their focus, and God won't let that happen, because Judah is not yet destined for deportation. Their sins have not reached that level yet. And so whether you want to think of it in terms of that God is protecting Jerusalem, the holy city, or that God is protecting Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, and from a political standpoint, it's hard to really say, because
he did.
Either way, that's the net effect.
Yeah.
But like I said, I think it's interesting that the prophecies and the writings in general after David's time tend to focus so much more on Zion than on Canaan or on Judah specifically, or Israel or whatever specifically. They focus on Zion. They talk about going up to Zion. They talk about, the Messiah in the context of Zion and different things like that. So in Judah, or Jerusalem becomes central to that, I think. And for the Orthodox Jew, if you're going to have the city of Jerusalem, the city of David, the city of God, you need to have God's temple there, because the struggle that the Orthodox Jew has, that the ultra-Orthodox especially has, is Orthodox Judaism requires you to follow the law, and you just can't without the temple, without the altar, without the Holy of Holies, without those things. And on one level at least, there's a level of, there's an inherent futility to this, because some of the things that you need were kind of one-time deals, you know? You're never going to have another Ark of the Covenant, because the Ark of the Covenant was a specific thing that you could rebuild something that looked like it, but it wouldn't be the Ark of the Covenant, because that one was made under specific directions and under specific auspices of God. You can't rebuild that and say, now we've got the Ark of the Covenant again. And if you don't have the Ark of the Covenant, does that really even mean the Holy of Holies is really all that holy? You know, it seems like history has done everything it can to help the Jews see that this is not a system that's designed to keep working. But that's not, but the Orthodox Jew struggle with that.
Like many locations around there, Jerusalem is a very ancient city. And before it was Jerusalem, it was Salem. Abraham visited that. So Melchizedek was the king of Salem. So, and some say that Melchizedek is Noah's son Shem. So, you know, whether that's true or not, I don't know.
I've never heard that before. That's interesting.
Contemporaries apparently. And so it was called Shalem. And then it morphed into Yerushalem, and now Jerusalem. And the Yeru part is the foundation or cornerstone. And so I believe that that location has been set apart as a holy place for predates Israel, predates the prophets and
that's a really good point, and I think I appreciate you bringing that out. It's not just Israelite religion that says that. It goes back a very, very long way to where it's been associated with holy things, with religious things for a very, very long time. Perhaps more so than any place in history or any place in the world.
We don't understand a lot of this, but most of that region of the world, and really a very vast part about the world, considers their location as holy or objects to be holy.
Right.
And we don't think that way. So we wouldn't have a problem moving to Montana, because this is not a holy place for us, that we have to stay here, fight, dig in, and all of that. But see, all that exists over there. That's why it's so in trouble all the time, because someone else is squatting on somebody else's holy land all the time.
Exactly. And that's how the Arabs view the Israelis right now. That's how the Israelis view the Arabs right now. It's kind of, they're both in Jerusalem, and neither one of them likes the other one being there, you know?
Palestine, all of that stuff is always in dispute.
Yeah.
Well, the Crusades were going through that area.
Yes. That was the focus was, let's get Jerusalem back, because Jerusalem's the holy city, you know, so it's, I've read, you know, places, there are different things to talk about. Jerusalem is holy to three religions, but you actually bring out the point that really is probably holy to a lot more than that. It's just a lot of them don't necessarily have a major presence anymore, but historically speaking, it has tremendous significance. And you're right, this whole area, there are places all over in there that different prophets in different religions have had experiences, holy or religious experiences there. Bethel and is that where is it that Jacob saw I believe that's Bethel, going the angels going up and down. But there are a variety of places in there, and a lot of the same places that we read in the Bible of people having experiences are also where Muhammad or others did, and where other religions have had experiences as well. And it's interesting because my cynical isn't quite the right word, but my Western scientific way of thinking about things would tend to say that all of the Bible ones were real and all the other ones were just imagined and made up. But the simple reality is that if there's such significance to those places, it might not be surprising that people are having religious experiences and maybe misunderstanding them in those locations. Because certainly it seems like God has had a special focus in this area throughout all of history, and continues to have to some extent anyway. So, you know, and the difficulty, I think, for us is, as you say, we don't really have things like that in our lives, or if we do, they're not trinkets, but they're keepsakes kinds of things. We don't have places that are holy. The closest thing probably most of us have to something like that might be a cemetery plot where somebody really, really important to us is buried. That's about the closest most of us probably will come.
I guess when you think about it, it is really one of the part of the freedom that Christ gave us.
Yep.
And not being tied down
Absolutely.
to one point, one place that we think
Yeah.
is holy. We are the ones now that should have that temple inside
Yeah.
of us. And so we could go anywhere and take Christ
We,
with us.
we
you know?
carry the holiness around with us.
Right.
We don't need a location.
So
That's right.
that is
Yeah.
that freedom that we enjoy
Yeah.
because of Christ. We're not tied down just like the Israelites were, it seemed like, to a place. Now we're not that tied down. We're the chosen people. We're
Yeah.
the Israelites now, but we're not in a place.
And the practice of our religion does not require anything special.
Right.
You know, the instruments of our faith are as simple as they get. Bread and wine are some of the most basic staple foods in all of the world, and that's not the only thing that we need to have, you know, the communion as a specific thing. But the rest of it, you don't even need that. You just need people who want to pray and worship, you know, and if you're lucky, a written copy of the Word, you know. Jerry, you had your hand up.
Have you examined some of the prophecies? I've heard it said that some of those prophecies refer to the continued existence of Israel and the people, and that they will be hated for eternity or for the rest of the world. Have you looked at prophecies that would indicate that to you?
I don't, the problem for me is that most of the prophecies, given what Paul says and what others say in the New Testament about, Paul in particular in Romans talking about spiritual Israel and that the Christians are the spiritual heirs to Israel, the problem becomes that most of the prophecies that are designed, that may be intended to speak of things past AD 70 or so, presumably are speaking about Christians, or at least about the children of God in a broader sense. And so it seems unlikely to me that most of those prophecies would contain a specific element of, hey, it really still sucks to be a Jew, when everything else is focused on this
Well, I
greater
was
concept.
thinking not so much in the New Testament, but the
Well, no,
prophecies.
I agree with you. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Even in the Old Testament, so you think about, okay, so Daniel has a series of prophecies, and some of them clearly move into the Messianic era.
And maybe even during the time, some of Isaiah's
Yeah.
may have
Yeah, so
applied to the
there's
time
a-
in that 400
There's a number of
years.
them, and Malachi's prophecy about the day of the Lord is both the coming of Christ, but it's also the day of, almost certainly the day of judgment as well. So there's definitely some prophecies that are going past the point of Christ's time on earth in the Old Testament. But that said, just because the Old Testament was written primarily by and to Old Testament Israel doesn't mean that those prophecies only concern them. In fact, some prophecies explicitly concern other nations around them. But in the context of the Messianic prophecies and the post-Messianic prophecies, presumably, logically, if Paul is right, and since he's inspired, I'm assuming he is, if Paul is right, and in fact spiritual Israel is what exists now as the children of God, the chosen people, and not genetic Israel, then those prophecies, to the extent that they speak of Israel, are speaking of spiritual Israel. And Paul would make the argument that they always were, that they always talk about spiritual Israel, and not just the people that were descended from Abraham.
Okay, the next question then is why?
Why what?
Why are they still a nation? I mean, Assyria's gone, Babylon's gone, Persian's gone.
Why is Israel still a nation?
Why are they still there? I know you can't answer that question.
Well, I mean, I can speculate. I obviously can't answer it like definitively, but so there's the mundane answer, and then there's the supernatural, or the maybe quasi-supernatural. Actually, the mundane answer is that Assyria and Babylon and Greece and Rome, all, well, first of all, they're not gone. Assyria is Iran. Babylon.
But the nation,
Yes,
yeah.
the empires are gone. The thing about empires is that empires inherently end, because you can't conquer a bunch of other people and not have them eventually get tired of being conquered and either fight back or start their own empire up. In fact, we're going to see this, but let me just sort of give you the preview of next week. We talked about Xerxes, the king of Persia, last week. Xerxes, at the time that he was the king of Persia, controlled this, all of this, the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And Xerxes wanted more, and so Xerxes decided that the best thing to do would be to go on up in here and take this. And the Greeks objected to that. And the Greeks, who had always been a loose coalition of city-states and really fought with each other as much as they fought with anybody else, when Xerxes attacked, well, initially they had the Spartans and a few other groups of people held them off at Thermopylae until the Greeks could mobilize a defense, and ultimately the Greek states united and fought back Xerxes, and then they just kept going. And they just conquered, and they ultimately conquered all of this and took it all over. That's the problem with empires. If you're an empire, you set yourself up to fall eventually, because nobody likes an empire except the people who are in charge of it. And so the reality is that, and you can see this throughout history, you can see it through modern day empires as well. You can look at the empires of the Spanish and the French and the Dutch empires and the British empires, all of which grew and had tremendous success, but ultimately all of which were subject to rebellion and outside, and conflict, and ultimately contracted. And you can see it right now with America. We never were really an empire in the sense of conquering for the sake of conquering, but we controlled and influenced a lot of territories, and we are watching our control and influence wane even as we go along year by year now. Empires do not last, but peoples do. Peoples last. That's why I say that the Assyrians and the Babylonians are still seen and the Persians are still seen in Iran and Iraq and some of those nations there. The Roman Empire is still, what began the Roman Empire, the core of it, Italy, is still, Rome is still there, and the people of Italy are still there. Greece is still there, and the cities of Greece are still there, even though a lot of them are, newer now, and the older ones are still just ruins, but they're all still there. And so from a mundane standpoint, Israel was never an empire. I mean, we read about Solomon and we think, oh, Solomon had an empire. Solomon had controlled a very tiny portion of what we see as these empires here. They were never like that. And so even though they have been the subject of tremendous persecution and hatred over the years, they have also never set themselves up in a situation where it behooved the nations of the world to destroy them the way that the empires that have been, threats and controlled all of the people's lives did. So part of why the Israelites or Israel still exists is because the people endure, and because other great nations made the decision at the end of World War II to basically force the nations that were in Israel, in the land of Israel, to exit, or at least to live alongside the Israelis and allow them to go back into their nation. So that's the mundane answer. The spiritual answer, Paul talks about in Romans, this idea that his people are going to be around basically until the end, to some extent at least. The Israelites are going to be, even though they've largely been disobedient, that they're still going to be open and available to conversion. In fact, Paul seems to indicate that they're all going to be converted. At least all the ones who are spiritual Israel are going to be converted to Christianity eventually, which suggests that to some extent at least, God is still preserving them for some reason, whether it's because they were the chosen people and he has, whether it's because of the covenants he made with Abraham that were about his descendants. I think that might be the most likely one. Whatever it is, God seems to be concerned with Israel's continued existence, even if it's not the spiritual Israel that is central to the Bible story anymore. But that's where you get into this area of it goes. I mean, I can trace the mundane and show you why Israel still exists as a nation. I can only guess at the spiritual side of it, because ultimately that's what God is deciding to do for his own reasons that I don't entirely understand. But whatever the reason is, they do still exist, and have been preserved, however it is, for all this time. Although they've also gone through, for people who, for a nation that really never did try to conquer a big area, they have been the object of a greater level of hatred and persecution than almost any group of people throughout all of history. And it's astonishing that they do survive in some respects because of that. But ironically, the diaspora that happened under the Assyrians and the Babylonians probably helped them with that, because by distributing the Jews all over, a huge section of the world, it makes it really hard to destroy all of them when they're everywhere, in small numbers. It's not so easy. If they were all in one place, probably would have been a lot easier for some of these nations to do that if they wanted to, or when they wanted to. So. Okay, any other questions or comments about this? Okay, so what I want to take a quick look at, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit here, and we may not even go back to this again, not in detail. If you want to look over in Daniel chapter 2, there is a vision that Nebuchadnezzar has in Daniel chapter 2. And the reason I want to take a look at this is because Daniel's, actually it's Nebuchadnezzar's vision, but Daniel's interpretation of that speaks directly to this time between the Testaments, actually. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. I'm going to kind of skim through this, but essentially, I love Nebuchadnezzar's not a moron. I like that about him. Nebuchadnezzar knows that his magicians and his soothsayers and everything else, that they probably are making up their answers a lot of the time. And so when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, he calls in all of his wise men and astronomers and magicians and everything else, and says, I had a dream and I need you to interpret it for me. And they say, well, tell us the dream and we'll interpret it for you. And he says, no, you tell me what the dream was and then interpret it for me. And they're like, no, just tell us what it is and we'll be happy to do it. He's like, no, this is what's going to happen. You're going to tell me what it is, I'm going to kill all of you. so that'll concentrate your mind, I guess. But so of course they can't do it. And in fact, I love what they say in chapter 2, verse 10. It says, the astrologers answered the king, there is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. In other words, all of the kings before you were morons. That's, that you feel kind of good about yourself from that standpoint. So, like I said, he orders them to be executed. The commander of the king's guard hears about, or is going out to hear this, and Daniel hears about this and says, no, it's okay, I can interpret it. So, and I can tell the king what his dream was, and I can interpret it. So, so he gets together with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They pray. Ultimately, he receives a vision from God with the interpretation of the dream. And the dream itself, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and what he dreams of is this. This is in chapter 2, verse 31. This enormous statue. It's awesome in appearance. He says the head of the statue was made of pure gold. Its chest and arms of silver. Its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. And so he has this vision, and then it says, he says, while you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands, and struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces and became like chaff in the wind. So, his interpretation of this, then, over in chapter 2, starting in verse 36, he says, you, O king, are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory, and he says, you are the head of gold. So basically what he's saying to him is, Babylon is the head of gold of this statue. Then he says, after you, another kingdom will rise inferior to yours. That would be the silver, the chest and arms of silver. That kingdom is going to be Medo-Persia. We've already talked about that some. And then he says a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. So it's interesting because he kind of glosses over the Medes and Persians, and it's also interesting because from our perspective, a modern human perspective, Medo-Persia was a greater empire than Babylon. It controlled more territory. It was vaster and more powerful. But whether this is a matter of kind of buttering up your audience or what the deal is exactly, clearly there was an intention that Babylon be seen as the greatest empire. at least in the context of the greater of the two relative to Medo-Persia. And probably at least part of this was because ultimately Babylon was the one that was tasked with taking Judah and Jerusalem into captivity. And so, in a sense, they were given the greatest honor, so to speak, that could be given in the sense that they were the ones that were responsible for carrying out God's judgment against his people, which was a sad necessity. In any event, he gets to the third kingdom, one of bronze that will rule over the whole earth. That's Greece. And then finally, there will be a fourth kingdom strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and it will crush and break all the others. And that's speaking of Rome. And then finally, he says there that the feet are of clay and iron. And what the general belief is that what it's talking about is basically later in the Roman Empire's existence, you have basically the Roman Empire splinters, and you have Byzantium, you have a weakening of the Caesars and of the rule because there's infighting and everything else. And then, of course, ultimately, all of this is destroyed by this stone that Daniel mentions. And in general, the conclusion is that rock, because he says it's not cut by human hands, that rock is the church, is the Messiah, because it talks about the God of heaven setting up, and this is in verse 44, the God of heaven setting up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to other people. So this is talking about the kingdom of heaven. Now, I'm not going through right now, especially given our time constraints, I'm not trying to go through and explain to you why it appears that these different parts of the statute do correspond to these nations. We'll talk about each of them in the context of the prophecy of Daniel as we talk about those kingdoms. But suffice it to say that when you look through history, the four great kingdoms that we see are, at the point that he's talking about this, are Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Greece is kind of a two-part kingdom, and Egypt makes one last gasp at relevance between Greece and Rome, but ultimately Egypt never really gets anywhere back to where they had been before, and so it's those four. And so that's kind of what we want to think about, want to recognize is the book of Daniel, and actually Daniel has three different visions throughout the course of the book. One by Nebuchadnezzar, two others that were given directly to Daniel, each of which illustrate this basic concept in a different way. He's gonna have a vision of beasts, and I forget the last vision that he's going to have, but he has a series of visions basically that all highlight this notion of these great kingdoms, and then ultimately of the Messiah or a messianic figure or event that overthrows the kingdoms of the earth. And of course, the instinct is to say, well, there have been great kingdoms since then, right? I mean, there were some of those empires I was talking about. Spanish Empire, China is an empire, and it has several empires, and the British Empire, and there's been these other empires since then, and I think the response to that is that once the church comes around, the kingdom of heaven comes around, the empires of the earth cease to be nearly as important as they were before that. They're still, I don't mean that they're not important in the lives of people and how things happen, but in terms of from a spiritual standpoint, from a functional spiritual standpoint, nations are not nearly as important as the kingdom of heaven, which exists wherever Christians are. And it's not limited by geography, like we were talking about a little bit ago. It's not limited by who has control of some area of the world. It's wherever Christians are, the kingdom is there. And so that kingdom, that will inherently overcome. It's kind of like, if you're trying to build castles right at the seashore, the water is always going to eventually overrun them because you can't stop the tide. And when you have something that's flexible and that is not tied to a specific location or to a specific set of needs, it's almost impossible to completely get rid of it. That sort of thing is always going to last longer than kingdoms that are built by men because its structure is not limited to places and people. It's limited, it can be anywhere. So, okay, we're going to stop because, well, it's time to stop. And next week we will start talking about Greece Sorry, no, yeah, Greece, yeah, right, okay.
Bacon grease.
Yeah, not cooking grease, not the tasty kind of grease. The other.